You're listening to the June 17, 2016 edition of the Surfwatch Cyber Risk Roundup, the weekly podcast that's focused on how the world of cybercrime is impacting business. The Surfwatch Cyber Risk Roundup is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Hey everybody, I am Jeff Peters, Surfwatch Labs editor, here with my partner in crime, Matt Leifus, Surfwatch Labs writer. On this podcast, each week we bring you the top 5 trending cybercrime events, advisories, and legal actions based on Surfwatch Labs data and analysis. So we'll jump right into it with the top cybercrime event from the past week.
Coming in number 1 this week, we're actually going to go back in time a little bit. I don't know, what was it, Jeff? Probably about a month and a half, 2 months ago, we were talking about this big POS data breach at Wendy's. And now, come to present day, within the last week or so, there's been more details about this breach, and it turns out that it was much bigger than was previously reported. Wendy's initially said that the number of stores impacted by this point-of-sale breach, which they're actually even in court for right now, I believe, over some of that.
Yeah, there's a lawsuit going on around that.
There was initially, they reported 300, it was fewer than 300 stores, which is still pretty big. However, the fast food chain also said last week that the intrusion may not yet be contained and that this point-of-sale breach could be much larger. They don't really know how much larger yet. That remains to be seen. According to Brian Krebs, spokesperson Bob Bertini said part of the problem was that the breach happened in 2 waves. He said the outside forensics investigators that were assigned to the case by the credit card associations initially found 300 locations that had malware on the point-of-sale devices, but that the company's own investigators later discovered a different strain of the malware at some locations. The investigation is still ongoing, and like I said, there isn't like specifics yet with that, but it does look like that this is a much bigger breach than was originally reported. Wendy's did go on the record, and I don't really know what this really means or implies, but Wendy's did say that all the breach stores were franchises rather than company owned. So I don't. Why say that? I mean, it's still Wendy's, right? Maybe I don't know how franchising works, but
Well, I remember when there was the Dairy Queen breaches and a lot of the point-of-sale breaches. I think, was that 2015 when that happened? Or no, it was probably 2014.
Something like that.
That's probably 2014. I remember there was a lot of talk about how it could potentially start to impact franchises because they might want to have a more overarching corporate policy about cybersecurity, which they didn't really have in the place for a lot of these franchisees. So I think they just want to point out that, hey, it's not the Wendy's Corporation necessarily, but
I don't think
the
in the eyes
franchises.
of the people they're really going to make the connection. Though.
Yeah, I don't think, the
Wendy's
average person doesn't care. This is interesting, though, because in the court case, the credit unions, I believe, are the ones who have a lawsuit going, and they were talking about how they basically said there's no way it can only be 300 just with the amount. They're saying that this is, one of the most impactful breaches that they've seen in terms of their losses. So it makes sense that it's actually is larger than this 300 stores. Moving on, another big story that broke this week is the DNC network. They were hacked. And I've been kind of chuckling about this story all week. It just keeps changing.
Right.
But what happened was the network of the Democratic National Committee was breached. They said it was by Russian hackers that gained access to this database. And then the big news in all the headlines is they stole opposition research on GOP presidential candidate Donald Trump.
There it is again.
Donald Trump comes up all the time.
Talking about Donald Trump again.
So the interesting thing here is the DNC, they said they hired, I believe it was CrowdStrike, and they did some analysis, and they said it was nation-state espionage. They're blaming it on the different Russian hacking groups. Interesting, they said that there was actually 2 separate breaches here. So according to the DNC and CrowdStrike, there was 2 hacker groups, one called Cozy Bear and one called Fancy Bear. Those are intimidating names there.
You're right.
So Cozy Bear apparently gained access last summer. They're basically in there for a whole year. They were monitoring the committee's email and chat communications. And then Fancy Bear, which is supposedly a competing Russian group, they don't really coordinate, perhaps like they should. They gained access in April, and they stole a couple of these files related to Donald Trump. and then that theft alerted them of the intrusion, and then they ended up discovering the other group in there. So kind of, this one group had this excellent espionage campaign going.
Right.
And then it sounds like this other group busted in, stole some stuff, and kind of
screwed it all up.
Yeah. They need to coordinate a little better.
Yeah, no kidding.
Then just yesterday, all this Donald Trump stuff got released. This 231-page document of opposition research about, how the DNC is going to attack Donald Trump. And this lone wolf hacker calling himself Guccifer 2.0, because the original guy is arrested, he's basically saying, hey, this wasn't Russians, this was just me, I did this whole thing. So there's been a lot of articles and speculation about whether CrowdStrike was wrong, was it really the Russians? From the little bit I've read on it, it seems like the documents that he released appear legitimate, but I don't know if I'm buying the fact that it was him and not the Russian hackers, at least based on the stuff I read.
Yeah, I would think that, number one, when you're talking about 231-page document on the negatives of Donald Trump, I think there's quite a bit of stuff out there. It's like, if you want to show that you're really behind this, how about you release something else, if that's what you're trying to do?
Well, that was the Ars Technica, they put out an article, and they said, they couldn't verify whether it was legitimate, but if it was a troll attempt, it was pretty impressive that within 24 hours of this announcement of the breach, someone had put together a couple 100-page troll document about it.
Right.
So it appears that the documents are legitimate and everyone's talking about them. I haven't really looked at them too closely because I'm sick of hearing about Donald Trump.
Right. And another thing to point back to is the actors that are involved in this, that Cozy Bear and more specifically Fancy Bear. We're actually going to get into that a little later in the podcast. Fancy Bear is a prolific advanced persistent threat group. And they actually have different names that some of us might recognize. That sometimes they go by the name of Pawn Storm, which is something we've talked about quite a bit, and a few others. So when they are, chasing this attack back and that name comes up, I would tend to think that's probably maybe a little more legitimate than this Guccifer or whatever we're talking about. Yeah, and it makes
sense. Just obviously the Russians have a history of targeting whoever the political leaders are, just as I'm sure we target Russians' political leaders.
Right. Coming at number 3, we're going to talk about a Japanese travel agency. It was breached. JTB, which is Japan's leading travel agency, said that unauthorized access to its server may have compromised the information of 7.93 million people. That's quite a handful. The information includes customer names, addresses, email addresses, and 4,300 valid passport numbers. It's believed an employee fell for a phishing email and opened a malicious attachment, leading to the theft.
I saw that story. There wasn't really a whole lot of information beyond that about that story, at least that I saw. But yeah, it sounds like it was a spear phishing email, or maybe even just a regular phishing email, but somehow they got infected with employees clicking, as always.
Yeah, and 7.93 million people at an airport, that's or a travel agency, that's pretty significant.
Yeah, and then coming in at number 4, we have another ransomware attack that led to some payment of funds. University of Calgary, they were the recent victim of a ransomware attack. Like I said, they ended up making a lot of headlines because anytime someone pays a ransom, everyone's talking about it. They chose to pay close to $16,000, is what the news reports were saying. Officials from the University of Calgary provided a brief statement about the attack, and they pointed out the difficulties in applying the decryption key offered by the hackers. They said that ransomware attacks and the payment of ransoms are becoming increasingly common around the world. The university is now in the process of assessing and evaluating the decryption keys. The actual process of decryption is time-consuming and must be performed with care. It is important to note the decryption keys do not automatically restore all systems or guarantee the recovery of all data. Still requires a great deal of work by IT. So, yeah, I think that's an interesting thing to point out. We always hear about these ransomware attacks, but you don't really hear about, well, just because you got the decryption key, it's not necessarily, flip a switch and suddenly everything's back to running as normal.
Yeah, it sounds like another reason why you shouldn't pay the ransom altogether. I mean, they were probably in a situation, though, where they had so much data, they clearly needed to get it back for whatever reason and probably
and we always seem to hear about this with, different government agencies, the universities, hospitals, like really kind of public things. Because I think normally if you pay, you're not going to put out a press release about it. But obviously if you're a government agency or if it's disrupting services where consumers are noticing, you probably...
You want to remain transparent and let everyone know what's going on. Yeah, sure. And coming in number 5, we're going to talk about iMesh, which is a file sharing service that I think I might have heard of back in
I believe they're not even... they shut down recently.
Yeah, I think they shut down in May. So users of this file sharing service, iMesh, they could have potentially had their user records compromised, as recent reports indicate the company was breached and 51 million users had their records leaked. The data compromised in this breach contains email addresses, username, password, IP address, the user's country location, and the user's join date. The attack actually took place back in September 2013. Users from 55 countries are affected, which include over 13 million users from the U.S. Just by itself. While iMesh, as Jeff was saying, they did officially shut down in May, the leaked passwords in this breach could contribute to a very common problem that we talk about quite a bit, password reuse. If you pay attention to our blog, one of the things we talk about quite often is the horrible passwords that we all use, and a lot of those passwords are then reused to log on to other accounts.
Yeah, and even if you have just one good password that you're reusing, well, if you used it in this iMesh breach or the LinkedIn breach or the Tumblr breach or any of these recent breaches, good chance it's out there and other people will probably be using it to try to get into different things. Now moving on to the top advisories. A lot of stuff. We were off last week, so obviously a lot of stuff's happened the last couple weeks. One of the big things we've seen is, even going back to the last podcast, we were talking about a lot of these big data dumps, the LinkedIn credentials that were on the dark web. And we saw a few more big dumps on the dark web just this past week. One of the ones that we saw was a hacker going by the name NSA. Yeah, that's nice. He has posted about 300,000 driver's licenses for sale on the dark web. And according to researchers, the bulk of these come from several breached organizations in Louisiana. So obviously, Louisiana citizens should be on the lookout. They're potentially the most impacted by this if this stuff gets sold and identity theft and stuff starts occurring.
And there's quite a bit of useful information that people could use off your driver's license, your number, your name, address, all that stuff.
Yeah, and then there was another big breach. We talked about the LinkedIn breach and this iMesh breach and all these credentials. Twitter is also among the large companies with these huge cache of accounts that are for sale on the dark web. There's a hacker, Tessa88. He is supposedly selling this large cache of Twitter accounts, about 32 million of them. And he's asking for 10 Bitcoins for the information, which currently is about $5,800.
Yeah, and this Tessa88 actor, or however you want to go about calling this person, they've actually shown up in other dumps like this as well. I don't think it was LinkedIn or something like that, but they're kind of becoming more familiar, and that name keeps kind of turning up when we're talking about some of these data caches in the dark web that are turning up. So we'll be looking out to see if they have anything else they're gonna put up for sale or what's going on with that in the future.
Yeah, and we've been writing a lot about different dark web stuff on the Surfwatch Labs blog. So here's our weekly plug for the Surfwatch blog. Go check it out, blog.surfwatchlabs.com. And, we've profiled what's going on in the Alpha Bay market, what happened with Nucleus. I think the most recent one, we talked about the Dream market. We got another one coming up next week on Hansa market. So we're profiling different markets. If you're interested in what is for sale on the dark web, what these different markets are like, how they operate, how the whole thing works. We got a lot of good information by the different bloggers on the Surfwatch Labs blog you can check out.
Yeah, it's a great source of information, guys, honestly. And Jeff does an excellent job breaking down some of these dark web markets. You learn a lot from them. Now to kind of, shamelessly plug myself, there was a lot of noise this week concerning cyber espionage, so I took it upon myself. I posted an article this week about that. Kind of looked into Surfwatch Labs data to see what these cyber espionage actors were, who was trending, what they're targeting. It seemed like central government was probably the biggest target of these espionage attacks. However, this week alone, and we already talked about it a little bit with the Democratic National Committee, there have been quite a few espionage-related events and just news that made headlines this week. We chronicled a few of them, or I chronicled a few of them in the article, and we're going to start out with North Korea. They were in the news for a an attack against South Korea. The attack actually took place back in February 2014. It was discovered February 2016. North Korea actually attempted to hack more than 140,000 computers between various government and defense vendor systems. And one of the most notable things that North Korea was able to take from this was the blueprints for the wings of an F-15 fighter jet. So, when we think about espionage, we're looking for trade secrets, blueprints to things like this, intellectual property, things like that. And that clearly seemed to have happened in this. We mentioned the Democratic National Committee. That was an espionage-related event. We also had a campaign. These guys have been around for a little while. They're called the Sophisy Group. This is a Russian-linked cyber espionage group. They've recently attacked the U.S. government, a U.S. government official, with a spear phishing email. And what happened here was this email was sent from another country's Ministry of Foreign Affairs computer, and it had a malicious attachment and had this government official. And they didn't give a lot of information on who specifically they attacked or anything like that. This malicious attachment would have loaded the CarBurp malware, which I always find a fascinating name for malware, CarBurp. And this was a variant of the Sophisy Trojan. The Sophisy group has many names, and this is kind of what I was getting at before. They've been called Fancy Bear, which is what we were talking about with the Democratic National Committee. They've also been called APT-28, Pawn Storm, and Strontium, which actually I remember specifically talking about all of those. And it seems like they have ties to all being the same group. It's hard to say.
I remember one of the old guys we used to work with, we were talking about this, is that I think it's one of the problems really in cybersecurity is everyone comes up with their own name for these different actors. And obviously it's hard to say exact, attribution's hard, but that just adds to the confusion.
Yes.
Especially when you have a customer who says, I want to know more about the techniques that this one group is doing. Well, there's really 42 different names for the group.
Right. And so you look up this specific name, then that might be a whole lot for it, but it's because it's spread across 42 other
It would be nice if we could all coordinate and have like a set naming system. I know that's just a pipe dream.
Not to plug our blog again, but we also did an interview this week with one of our chief analysts, Aaron Bay, and we talked about cyber threat intel. And one of the things Aaron talks about is that one of the things we can do in cyber threat intelligence and cybersecurity is all work together and kind of have our knowledge base be the same and things like that. So it's a good piece of advice for sure. And the last thing I'm going to bring out with cyber espionage related events this week, there was an update on this advanced persistent threat group called Mofing. They're a Chinese group. They've been linked to several espionage events against the United States, Canada, Germany, India, and Singapore. The bulk of the group's attacks have been against the Myanmar government. What was unique about this group that was showcased is that a lot of these groups will use specifically exploits in software, things like that. This group solely relies on social engineering techniques and spear phishing. So it was just interesting to talk about. I think that article was covered on Softpedia pretty well, if people want to check it out. But a lot of good information about it, and it just this week really was a good demonstration how espionage attempts are alive and well.
Mm-hmm. Another thing a lot of researchers were talking about this past week is basically the disappearance of the Angler exploit kit. If you listen to this podcast, you know that all year Matt and I have talked about how the Angler exploit kit's really been pretty much the go-to kit behind a lot of these attacks I use for a lot of different infections and things. And apparently, a few different researchers have reported that I think it was around June 7th or June 8th, the activity for Angler pretty much just kind of dropped off almost completely. And they said that these criminals have now shifted away from using the Angler exploit kit and instead have been focusing on using Neutrino for their attacks. So a lot of people are speculating what is behind this drop-off. I believe on the last podcast we talked about how there was this huge crackdown on different criminals in Russia. I think it was the biggest collection of cybercrime arrests ever in Russia. But for now, it appears that Neutrino has taken Angler's place as the exploit kit of choice. And then I actually saw a good article today on SC Magazine by Dr. Peter Stevenson. basically about how the reports of the death of this Angler exploit kit may be a little bit premature. He did some research and said that there's still small levels of activity going on. But it was interesting. He noted that the prices for the competing malware and botnets, because the Nakurs botnet also saw a big drop off, the prices for the competitors have really skyrocketed since the 8th of the month when maybe it died or whatever happened. So some kind of shift going on there in the cybercrime world.
Sometimes when I think about that, it's just when we talk about like the Angler exploit kits versus the Neutrino, and I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it all accomplishes the same thing at the end of the day. So, it is interesting to point out, though.
It's like we were talking about the dark web markets. We've been profiling the different dark web markets, and Nucleus went down, and everyone was, where's everyone going to go now? And a lot of them went to Alpha Bay or Dream Market, and now you chop one head off and two more pop up, basically.
Well, let's get into malware updates for the week. Here are some malware advisories. First of all, if you happen to have a Sharp or Philips brand smart TV that runs the Android TV operating system, you are a winner for this advisory, and let me tell you why.
Woohoo!
This is very exciting news. Security researchers have found that these TVs running this operating system are vulnerable to ransomware attacks. Yes, those attacks that Jeff and I talk about every week. Are now attacking televisions, apparently. The ransomware variant putting these TVs at risk are called F-Locker. Researchers from Trend Micro described the recent F-Locker variant, and this is what they had to say. The latest variant of F-Locker is a police Trojan that pretends to be U.S. Cyber Police or another law enforcement agency, and it accuses potential victims of crimes they didn't commit. Based on our analysis, there is also no major difference between a F-Locker variant that can infect a mobile device and one that can affect smart TVs. So it looks like they're using it's the same exact malware threat. It's just able to go on to a smart television. And I think we actually talked about this this threat actually in previous podcasts where it came on and says, I don't know what they accuse you of, but
I know there used to be like the child pornography ones was a popular one years back where I actually saw someone's computer and this is before I really knew much about cybersecurity, but someone was just freaking out because their computer froze. He was like, I don't know what I did. And he thought he was going to get arrested by the cops.
Pop up on your computer.
I was a little younger then. Now I just laugh about it.
Yeah, right.
But
go ahead, Jeff.
I was going to say, we've been kind of waiting for this. I mean, obviously, people have been talking about ransomware in Android phones, but now if it can go to other Android devices like TVs, obviously the reach of ransomware could get much, much bigger when you're trying to binge watch your favorite TV show on Netflix and suddenly you get locked up.
I think this is the start of something. Not long ago, Jeff and I, we used to kind of find material for these articles, and we called them Experts Weigh In. One of the things we talked about was kind of like a death by IoT and we had a lot of experts kind of weigh in on that. And I'm telling you, this is the start of it right here. You have all these internet connected devices. Now it's ransomware. Pretty soon they're going to, I'm just kidding. I don't actually think that.
Well, like the whole IoT thing, what sparked that article, I mean, this was from a couple of years ago, was there was this cybersecurity company I've probably talked about on the podcast before because I thought this was hilarious. But they tried to get a lot of press by basically predicting that we were going to see the first death by IoT, with someone hacking into an internet-connected stove and filling the house with gas and exploding it and killing children. And it was like, okay, yeah, guys. But like this actually makes sense because there's a profit motive behind there.
Right.
I mean, unless you're just a complete psychopath that wants to murder people. Here there's potentially millions of dollars that could be made if you could get something like this to work.
That's true. Smart TVs are definitely not going anywhere.
The only other interesting thing I saw about this is I believe this malware doesn't request Bitcoin. It actually requests iTunes gift cards.
Yeah, and I've seen that, and that's a popular trend. One thing we talk about Bitcoin quite a bit, and I actually read an article about this probably a couple months ago. And Bitcoin, it's a very popular currency, especially among cybercriminals, because it's very hard to trace what's going on. Well, it's the same concept with like Apple iTunes. It's really kind of untraceable. You have people pay for something in like Apple iTunes, like gift cards, whatever else. It's very hard to trace back to where it's being spent and who bought it, and so it's another popular method. And who knows what's going on with Bitcoin? I mean, it seems they went through such a a rough time with being hacked and people losing funds.
I just read that the price of Bitcoin's really going up because of what's going on. I guess there's a lot of demand over in China for it.
Really?
So it's driving up the price.
And that might be a good thing,
I mean, I'm no Bitcoin expert. That's just from my it was just like a Twitter headline I saw, so don't take it as gospel. And everyone put their money into Bitcoin.
We're financial analysts now.
Yeah.
Coming in, the second malware advisor we're going to talk about this week has to do with the Vautrak banking malware, and it's received an upgrade. It's now being called Vautrak 2, and has already been identified in attacks against newer targets throughout different geographies, typically different from where it was initially targeting. John Shear of Sophos gave a little description of the malware and its new capability. I thought he did pretty good, just a quick summing it up. This malware used to have one monolithic binary that contained the entire payload, although the newest version now contains other modules. This may point to the ability to build particular custom modules for customers. It makes it easier to deliver the payload, which makes a lot of sense. They're making it more efficient, essentially, and it can do more with it. Moving on to the trending settlements, lawsuits, and legal news, I'm going to get us started on this one, Jeff, and then hopefully you can kind of kick off. Jeff is our resident legal expert. I try to kick in maybe a little bits when I can, but Jeff has really got a nose for this, does a good job. To kick things off, we're going to talk about a Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act hearing. Now, for those that are unaware, this was part of a bill that President Obama signed in December 2015, which is part of this omnibus spending bill. A House subcommittee hearing was held on Wednesday to provide oversight. The hearing provided both praise and criticism around legislation, which was designed to help organizations share cyber threat information. Jeff, what was going on with this? What did you learn?
Yeah, actually, I listened to the cool thing. Depends what you define cool as, but the cool thing about government nowadays, you can actually go on and it's like a 2-hour hearing. You can watch the whole thing.
Yeah.
I didn't get a chance to watch the whole thing. I had to actually do some work today. But so yeah, the main thing that this bill is about is being able to share cyber threat information between the private sector and the public sector. And the United States Telecom Association Vice President of Industry and State Affairs, the guy's name is Robert Mayer, he praised the liability protections that the bill provided, saying that in the past the lack of such protections was one of the most serious impediments to sharing this information. But then there was also some negative stuff as well. A lot of people have been writing about the small business aspect. Small businesses are really still struggling with cybersecurity and how this might not necessarily help them all that much, when they're already struggling to do the basics and to afford it and all that kind of stuff. But the interesting thing here is that in March, the Department of Homeland Security officially launched the Automated Indicator Sharing Program, and that's basically what's sharing these different indicators. And some of the headlines are kind of making fun of it, that there's only been 30 businesses so far that are currently receiving the service. It's only been 3 months, but Matt Eggers, he's the policy expert with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He said that they have more than 100 signed up. So we'll see if that gets gets the snowball rolled and more people, more businesses jump on that, and we get really a lot more of this sharing that the government would like. So that was one of the big stories that everyone was talking about. Another one that I saw a lot of headlines had to do with the SEC. They fined Morgan Stanley $1 million over an insider breach. And I don't know if you remember this, Matt, but a while ago, back in January 2015, Morgan Stanley, they discovered data on approximately 900 of his clients posted online.
Mm-hmm.
And they did this big investigation, and they ended up finding out that one of their employees, Galen Marsh, he had conducted nearly 6,000 unauthorized searches of this confidential client information. Then he uploaded that information of those 730,000 clients to a server at his home in New Jersey. And then what happened was his server ended up getting hacked. So it was like basically he took some information and then someone ended up hacking him.
Right.
So that's kind of the background for this fine. Morgan Stanley has agreed to pay this $1 million penalty because of its failure to protect consumer information. Specifically, the SEC said that the company failed to adopt written policies and procedures reasonably designed to protect customer data. And that as a result of these failures, this employee was able to access and get all this data, and then ultimately leading to this hack.
Next, we're going to talk about the security company ADT, and they're involved in a class action lawsuit. Recently, the company actually filed a motion to dismiss this class action lawsuit, alleging that its system's unencrypted wireless communications makes them vulnerable to hacking. So, going into a little, what's the backstory on this, Jeff?
Yeah, so what happened here is basically there was a couple years ago, a researcher, I believe it was at someone's birthday party or something. He did his little trick where he showed his friend that he could basically interfere with this ADT's wireless signal. I believe because it's unencrypted wireless communication, so I think like the alarm didn't go off or something like that. And so this researcher did this study, published it. It got a lot of attention a year or two ago. And then this guy said, hey, I got an ADT system. I'm going to file a lawsuit about it.
Oh, fair enough. Okay. Well, here's what the company's arguing. They're arguing that neither the plaintiff nor anyone else has actually been hacked, and that only one researcher was able to interfere with the signals in a controlled setting. And this is exactly what they had to say. In all the decades that ADT has served these millions of customers, ADT is aware of no instance in which a customer's alarm system has ever been disabled by hackers disrupting these wireless signals. Nor does Michael Edinburgh's complaint allege, and so obviously you know who's behind this complaint with the lawsuit, nor does Michael Edinburgh's complaint allege any such disruption to his own ADT alarm system. In this hearing, further dismissal is actually scheduled for July 28th, which is coming up next month.
Yeah, so, I mean, that seems fair. That's kind of the same thing we see with a lot of the data breaches. They say, well, they stole your information, but
were you harmed?
But were you harmed? Here It's saying nothing even happened. It didn't even get that far.
They show up like, what are we talking about?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm no expert, but I would predict that it would get dismissed, but who knows?
Kind of reminds me of, for basketball fans out there, Allen Iverson, his famous rant when he's going, we're talking about practice. It just kind of...
We're talking about practice, man. Practice. And then coming in at number 4, we have the net neutrality ruling. Obviously, a lot of people talking about that. A federal appeals court has ruled that the FCC has the authority to reclassify internet service providers as common carriers. So basically saying that the internet is a utility rather than a luxury. So Wired put out an article. They said that basically this means the FCC can now enforce the net neutrality rules that it passed last year. And these rules prohibit ISPs from blocking or throttling certain types of content, as well as banning companies from paying for higher prioritization. So that, for example, Netflix pays more money, so they get to stream faster, and then Netflix's competitor can't really get a foothold in the market because they're, behind the 8 ball because they're going to have crappier streaming quality.
Woot woot for net neutrality. Sounds good to me.
No, yeah, it sounds good, but the fight's likely not over.
Right.
The general counsel for AT&T, he said that they expect the issue to ultimately be decided by the Supreme Court, so probably going to keep moving up the chain there. To wrap up the legal section, we got another espionage-related story. The U.S. has accused a Chinese man of economic espionage. A Chinese software developer has been charged with stealing source code from a U.S. company with the intent to sell the code for his own profit, as well as to share that information with an agency within the Chinese government. So this source code is related to a clustered file system that facilitates faster computer performance by coordinating work among multiple servers. And this source code has been described as a product of decades of work, and the employer took significant precautions to protect the source code as a trade secret, but this guy ultimately stole it. Now, the interesting thing here is the Department of Justice didn't actually name the employer, but the BBC and other media outlets, they've noted that this guy is listed on IBM's website,
right.
And he's still currently listed as an employee of IBM. So everyone's basically saying that it's an IBM employee and IBM source code.
It makes a lot of sense. Considering his job and So
that wraps up the top trending events, advisories, and legal actions from this week. Now moving on, we have our funny story of the week.
Well, it wasn't that long ago when the Federal Health Insurance Exchange, site healthcare.gov, was massively criticized and ridiculed for its bugs, lack of security, and just for being an overall disaster of a website. It was.
Yeah, the rollout was not handled
It was
well.
horrendous. It's amazing how things can change over time, though. In a recent poll from the 8th Annual Trust Audit and Honor Roll from the Online Trust Alliance, healthcare.gov had the second highest rating among 1,000 websites that were judged based on trustworthiness, based on domain, brand and consumer protections, website and server security, and online privacy policies, meaning that this website has become a well-oiled machine and it's pretty safe. So take that for what it is. I just thought that was kind of impressive because we talk about, cybersecurity and, implementing protections, and really paying attention to what's going on. A lot of companies are doing that. Well, here you have a website that was a monumental disaster, and now it's being recognized for how well it's running and protections and things like that. So Twitter on this poll has won first place for the 4th consecutive year, which says something because we were just talking about how Twitter had all these user accounts dumped on the dark web. I mean, it still happens. But here was the list of the top 10 that we can go down real quick. And some of these websites kind of surprised me because we use them every day. So number 1 was Twitter. Number 2 was healthcare.gov. Number 3 was Pinterest. Number 4 was the White House website. Number 5 was Dropbox. Number 6 was fileyourtaxes.com. I might have to check that one out. Number 7 was LifeLock. 8 was Instagram. 9 was 1040.com, and 10 was Gap Incorporated. So that's
go for the Gap.
Yeah, kind of the oddball of the group. But this kind of reminds us, cybersecurity is not lost. It's not a losing battle. If we put some effort into things and try to make them better, you seriously can go for better. Because I'm telling you right now, if you read the reports on healthcare.gov when it came out, it was a mess, and people were like, "This isn't even going to work." So, kudos to them.
And that wraps up this week's podcast. The Surfwatch Cyber Risk Roundup is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs helps organizations and service providers quickly establish a strategic cyber threat intelligence operation that drives more effective use of their tactical defenses. For interviews with cyber experts, check out Surfwatch Labs' other podcast, The Cyber Chat. And for more information on cyber threat intelligence, check out surfwatchlabs.com.